Beyond Integrity?
Yeah, in the Beyond Integrity book, look up the Rundle article on page 204. Okay, last time, please do watch the video from Tuesday's class. Okay, and watch it. I would actually commit it to you before you take the exam. There is a little bit from Tuesday's class that is relevant for the exam. But the exam is open book, so if you haven't watched it before you take the exam, you can watch it like during the exam if you need to, okay? But last time we talked about Christian ethics and globalization, and I criticized, or I leveled some criticisms, I referenced some criticisms of some of the actions of MNCs, or multinational companies, in a global context. Okay, let me just give you a running background. This will take like 5 minutes in case you didn't see Tuesday's lecture. Okay, globalization has brought goods and bads. One thing that it arguably has contributed to is an increase in the exploitation of developing world workers. And this is an arguable assertion, because some would say, well, they're better off than they would otherwise be. Okay, because otherwise they'd be subsistence farmers or something similar. Okay, hey, one of these days we're going to play them in football. We almost beat Texas Tech last year, this last fall. We'll be a sacrificial lamb for UT Austin one of these days.
That's pretty.
I don't have any football players in the room, right? Okay. All right, that's probably for the best. Okay, our 230-pound lineman going up against their 340-pound lineman? Not a chance. Okay, the global context that has become characteristic of the supply chains of MNCs has meant that MNCs can now go to the cheapest possible location in the world to make the products that they're seeking to make, whether that's electronics in China, or garments in Honduras, okay, or shoes in Vietnam or Indonesia. MNCs can now go to the cheapest possible location. And this has meant an increase in worker exploitation, some would argue, in certain parts of the world. Okay, come on in, Daniel. We're going to talk right now, though, about the constructive aspects of the global supply chain phenomenon. And Rundle thinks that there are actually very constructive things that Christian business persons can do in the context of a global level supply chain environment. Okay, and if you look on page 204, Rundle lays out in the second column there at the top the argument that he's going to make here. He says Christian business people are doing what was once the exclusive purview of missionaries. That is, they are having a material, social, and even a spiritual impact in some of the poorest and most isolated places in the world. And Rundle goes on to talk about how, yes, it is true that lots of MNCs are doing dastardly deeds. You know, just pillaging local communities for the labor. And then once the factory has made the garments that they need to make, it just moves on and leaves a derelict building. Okay, that is for sure the case. At the same time, Rundle says, that doesn't mean that all have to do that or are doing that. Some are not. Some are actually making an effort to contribute to local communities. And it is an environment in which space can be made for Christian business persons to make a difference. In other words, you don't have to be one of the pillaging, destructive business persons finding vulnerable developing world workers. Okay, you can be, we can be, the change that needs to be seen in this area of business, the supply chain area of business. And in particular, we can contribute to the constructive development of local communities. And Rundle lays out how this happens. Okay, on page 207 in the first column, Rundle writes, foreign investment by MNCs contributes to a country's social and economic well-being in many ways. One of the most obvious and immediate benefits is the inflow of capital, a scarce resource in many developing countries that is essential for economic growth. MNCs also facilitate economic growth and social transformation by linking up with local suppliers for their inputs. A little further down, Rundle writes, another benefit can be seen in the local labor markets. Researchers are finding that with the notable exception of low-skill and low-margin industries such as toys, clothing, and sporting goods, linkages between MNC and local suppliers usually lead to improvements in the working conditions, pay, and training of local workers. I'm not sure what they're comparing that against. Maybe they're comparing it against alternative factories, but not alternative farming. I'm not sure. I'd have to see a little more granularity on that study. But Rundle says, look, the inflow of capital is a constructive thing if used rightly to help build communities rather than to pillage communities and take from them, and to promote the welfare of the peoples. Okay. Now, at the same time, Rundle is also nuanced on these kinds of influences, so I appreciate that part about this article. It's not just a gung-ho, yeah, pro-globalization, pro-supply chains, run by Western companies kind of an article. Okay, he says, for instance, rightly, I think, on page 207 in the middle of the column there, perhaps the most subtle and controversial impact Western MNCs are having is in the area of culture. For example, in his 10-year study of MNCs in China, Santoro found that MNCs are imparting ideas and values that are quite radical in that country. Okay, more specifically, the democratic ideals that are often taken for granted in the West are firmly embedded in our culture, corporate culture, and often transferred unwittingly. The Western MNCs, without a doubt, have had an enormous cultural impact on local cultures around the world and have replaced their local values, local principles, local heritage with Western style thinking, Western style heritage. Okay, and I personally think that most of the time that's probably not a good thing. Maybe in the case of countries where they have a heritage that's really, filled with corruption or lots of destructive civil wars, destructive local peoples fighting with each other. That might be a good thing, but I think most of the time it's bad for the Western MNCs to be displacing culture alongside their business involvement. Now, if you turn the page to the Zwolinski article on page 227, we see a nice little summary here of some of the working conditions that are going on in these settings. Okay, and Zwolinski tells us a little bit. I like this article a lot. Zwolinski tells us a little bit about why it is so hard to change this system. Okay, let's talk about this notion of sweatshops for a minute. What they are, how they arise, and why they exist. And also why it's so hard to change the system. Early on in early stage capitalism in the 19th century, it was really paradoxical because all these new technological innovations were occurring, and it was leading to an incredible displacement in worker habitats and working conditions. So people were moving from family farms to cities where they worked in factories. And it was paradoxical because it seemed for a time as though actually every step forward in capitalist innovation, every step forward in terms of machine invention or the more efficient deployment of capital actually led to steps backwards in worker treatment and worker lifestyle and worker just general worker well-being. You can see this, for instance, if you're into literature, you can see this characterized in the work of Charles Dickens. If you think of the famous book Oliver Twist, there are other texts, Hard Times, David Copperfield, these kinds of Dickens texts characterize the terrible working conditions of early 19th century workers. Now, the history here is interesting because there was a backlash against early period capitalism. This backlash occurred from about the 1880s, I would say. Again, I'm speaking very roughly here. 1880s to maybe the 1930s or so. Okay, it seems to have died off to a large extent after World War II. This backlash took the form of workers' rights movements, union movements, other kinds of anti-predatory practices movements. Okay, and again, this was a response to early 19th century capitalism, which was very brutal and predatory in its treatment of workers. Okay, and unions became very powerful. They arose all over the capitalist world. The AFL-CIO Congress was one of the most powerful unions in the United States. Teamsters, a very powerful union enterprise. And unions ended up creating much better working conditions for the workers. Okay, and nowadays, all over the Western world, working conditions are dramatically better than they were for low-level workers at the beginning stages of capitalism. A number of innovations have occurred to promote better working conditions. These include things like minimum wage. Okay, so management can't just negotiate workers down to the lowest possible wage that the market will bear. There's like a non-market force, the government, that has inserted itself and says, no, this will be the lowest wage that will be allowed for American workers, or for any, we have minimum wages in all the Western countries. Okay, but also not just minimum wage, also working conditions. OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, okay, is a crucial part of worker treatment regulation here in the United States. It's a government agency that a lot of employers dislike. My dad was a small business owner for many years before he retired just this last year. And he hated OSHA because OSHA had all sorts of minute regulations that they required him to follow in order to ensure that he was treating workers fairly. And I totally get it. I understand that criticism. But at the same time, the presence of these kinds of regulatory agencies leads to better worker conditions in this country. Okay, now, what we are seeing right now, what has arisen since, I would say, the 1980s to the present, maybe the 1970s, if we want to go back a little bit further. We are seeing a return to early stage capitalism. It's been an extraordinary kind of a move, economically speaking. Okay, how is this happening? What's going on here? Well, what's going on is this. Globalization has brought the world closer together, and it has meant that companies can now very easily and very cheaply make their products in developing countries for a fraction of what it costs to employ American workers. But these developing countries did not go through the painful processes of early stage capitalism in the 19th century or of the union movement in the early 20th century. These developing countries don't have worker protections in place. They don't have minimum wages. They don't have worker treatment requirements in their factories. They don't have laws requiring a certain quality of the air that the factory workers breathe. And so what's going on is completely a return to early 19th century capitalism, where the MNCs find themselves in environments where there's virtually free rein for them to do as they please with regard to maximizing their margins and treating the workers a particular way. And we have seen a return to sweatshop labor. That's what we have seen, okay, over the last, it's about 50 years now, 40 years or so. There's been a return to sweatshop labor, okay? And the sweatshops are now no longer in the West. Sweatshops are elsewhere. And let's look a little bit at why the sweatshop system exists, why it has reemerged, okay, why it exists, and especially why it is so hard to get rid of. In fact, and I'll say this just before we look at this Walensky article, you, I, all of us may agree that it is a bad thing to have developing world factories where the workers breathe carcinogenic chemicals, so much so that, 50, 70% of workers in developing world factories have breathing problems. We can all agree that that's a bad thing. But it is so hard to stop that. Because in a system of free enterprise, maybe you don't want to run your company that way, but if everyone else is running their company that way, or they're employing workers in developing world factories who are in, poor conditions, and as such, those companies are maximizing their margins because it is always more efficient to have the workers working in the poorest possible conditions. If everybody else is doing that, then they're going to undersell you when it comes to consumer goods, and you're going to be priced out of the market. So no individual actor can bring about reforms here. I'll talk a little bit more about the dynamics of that setup after we get into the Zwolinski article. Okay, but if you look on page 228 in the second column, Zwolinski is using apparel manufacturing, which is kind of the poster child here. Apparel manufacturing is like the classic sweatshop situation. Apparel manufacturing as an example of precisely why this system has re-arisen and is taking place now. Okay, so bottom of the second column. The inherent volatility of the market for fashionable apparel rendered this system of homework economically efficient for manufacturers. Okay, weather, season, and most of all changes in taste can have a dramatic impact on the sorts of apparel demanded by consumers on any given day. A trendy outfit, which can sell for hundreds of dollars one month, can easily lose over 50% of its value over the next several months. Fashion retailers are thus faced with the risk of winding up with large stocks of goods for which there is no longer any consumer demand. Not unexpectedly, most retailers react to this risk by trying to shift its cost to elsewhere in the production cycle. By placing orders for only as many clothes as they can reasonably expect to sell in a short time, retailers push the risk down to manufacturers. Instead of retailers facing the prospect of being stuck with clothes they cannot sell, manufacturers are forced to adjust their production processes to the quickly changing demands of retailers and to run their businesses on the basis of the unpredictable revenue streams such orders produce. A little further down, thus the risk is passed down from retailer to manufacturer and likewise from manufacturer to contractor and subcontractor until ultimately it is borne by the individual worker. What Zwolinski is saying is this. There has arisen here in the West, I refer to the West, all the developed countries, certain tastes or trends. And these have an impact a world away on the people on the other end of things. Okay, the clothing decisions that you and I make are far removed from those people, but they have an impact on those people. And when tastes change dramatically, is what Zwolinski is saying in this paragraph, like they often do, apparel manufacturers have to keep up. Now, it's hard to continually be keeping up with these kinds of trends. And in fact, they'd have to reconfigure whole swaths of machinery on a regular basis to do that, and that's expensive to do. So the way they keep up is by making individual workers bear the risks and ultimately pay the price of the changes occurring in the supply chain. Okay, so individual workers are the ones who they are much more flexible than machines, obviously, and individual workers are the ones who have to pivot and change, be hired and fired very easily. These are mostly just treated as temporary contract laborers. They don't have any kinds of contractual protections ensuring that the contract will continue for a reasonable or decent duration. Okay, and the companies hire these individual workers so as to ensure that they have the means to make the latest trends, the latest apparel trends. But as soon as that trend moves on, if the companies need to let the individual workers go, they can do so. Whereas if they had sunk a lot of money into machinery, they would not be able to make money in the same way. Okay, so the individual workers are easier to hire and then to fire, or to make change. They're flexible, more flexible than the machines, and so ultimately the individual workers bear the risk. On page 229 at the bottom of the second column, Zwolinski writes, the return of sweatshops is usually seen as a byproduct of globalization. The rise of the multinational corporation, manufacture for export in many developing countries, the elimination of barriers to trade, and increasing freedom of migration have all served to lessen the cost of labor for corporations. Perhaps the most important development is the way in which increasing access to foreign labor pools has enabled industries to move production offshore so as to take advantage of lower costs of doing business. Okay, this is access to foreign labor also affects U.S. labor directly insofar as it causes domestic manufacturers to look for ways to lower their costs in order to compete effectively. Okay, there are a few more things that I want to say about sweatshops. In particular, I want to talk about how it's so difficult to eliminate them, why they are so entrenched. But let me pause for just a minute and ask if there are any reflections or questions so far on what I've been saying about the Zwolinski article, or about the history, the backgrounds, in capitalism, or about the reemergence of sweatshops in recent years. Questions or reflections? Okay. Cool. All right, well, let's keep going then. Okay. So on page 232, Zwolinski gets into the ethics of this. He stops describing the nature of the system and gets into the ethics of it. He says, by any first world standard of decency, sweatshop conditions are atrocious. But then he writes, here are two questions that we need to ask. First, are companies who contract with sweatshop manufacturers doing anything wrong? And second, whether they are wrong or not, what should we do about the situation of sweatshops? This is a really important question. Okay, so let's explore this together. Are MNCs who use sweatshop labor doing anything wrong? Now, I want to talk about a couple background assumptions behind this question before we explore it together. I'm assuming here that the labor is voluntary. I'm assuming it's not physically coerced. I'm assuming the workers are working there. It's not prison labor, right? Yeah, I'm assuming the workers are working there under their own free will. At least they signed a contract, and I'm assuming no one compelled them to sign the contract using any kind of, explicit force or anything.
We can assume that.
Yes.
We can confirm it, but we can assume it at this point.
We can assume it, sure. Fair enough. Okay, now assuming that, it's a free contract, right? I mean, let's make the case on behalf of the MNCs. Okay, it's easy to hammer the MNCs and say, you guys are doing like terrible dastardly deeds. Let's make the case on their behalf. We are entering into, they might say, a free contract with free laborers who are choosing to work for these kinds of wages. Yes, they are very low, very, very low by American standards, but they choose to work for these kinds of wages. They don't have to take the contracts that we give them. So what we are doing is actually just engaging in consensual business arrangements with others who are also engaging in consensual business arrangements with us. So what do we say? What do we say if somebody makes the pitch for MNCs on their behalf by making that kind of an argument? What do we say? Yeah.
I wouldn't. This just occurred to me, but I'm not so sure it is like physically not somewhat coerced, because if someone comes and they see that how much they're gonna get paid, they're like, I don't want it, then they're being like, all right, where else are you gonna work? Where else are you gonna get these
Okay.
So even though they don't want to do it, they have no other choice.
Okay, so Matthew, so the argument here is that there's a form of soft coercion that's taking place. No physical coercion is taking place, but it's soft coercion in that people's options are limited. Is that what you're saying? Yeah. If their options are limited, then I mean sometimes, assuming you want to stay in the community that you grew up in, or find some way to make ends meet near your family or something like that, you're going to have to take whatever deal you're given in these factories. Okay. But again, let me push back on behalf of the MNCs. The workers at the end of the day could do otherwise. They could choose otherwise. And you might say, well, they could choose to starve. But really, their options aren't usually choose to starve. It's usually something like choose to do something incredibly inconvenient, like travel to a large city hundreds of miles away from the homes of their birth. Or accept a lower standard of living than what even these factories provide, doing something else that's even worse. Okay, I don't know, like cleaning pigsties or something. I don't know. Yeah, Daniel.
Just to clarify, we're defending the big companies that are running the sweatshops, right?
Before I attack them, I think it's easy to attack them. So I'm trying to make the case on their behalf and say it's a free contract. It might be argued that what's going on is not immoral.
Yeah, I was just gonna give a comment on their behalf.
Go for it.
Oh, sure, go on to. But I was just thinking is that, well, one thing is that, the sweatshops does provide a job for a lot of people. It's better than no jobs.
Good.
Another thing is, at this point, what we're looking at is like Nike, Adidas, or whatever, Apple, Samsung, whoever it is, they all have their own sweatshop somewhere in the world.
Right.
And at the very beginning, that very first company that started the sweatshop, maybe everyone will be like, that's unethical, that's like psychologically torturing the workers, and that's wrong.
Right.
But at this point, there's so many of them, the companies that don't run the sweatshops will be called wrong because they will be outsourced to the market. They will be eliminated by the market itself because they have to have a higher price of their products.
They have to compete, and to compete, they have to have similar kinds of labor practices.
Exactly, and the fact that, and it kind of goes backwards, is that the company that runs the sweatshop, they have to make enough money to continue to support the sweatshop so that those people can have a job.
Right.
Those people have somewhere, and like Foxconn, they provide housing for the workers. So,
Sure, and because of that, other sources of housing dry up.
Exactly.
So if they did not now provide those dormitory-style houses for the workers, there's nothing else, because nothing else in the community, everything else has died off in terms of that provision in the community. So
Right,
this is the community now.
And the companies and let's just call them corporates only have so much budget on these things, and whether it's like for the whole factory, they pay power, water, resources, paychecks, payrolls, and all of the manufacturing costs, everything else, all that's relevant, and research and R&D and everything. So like all of that coming down somewhere with some people, their pay has to be squeezed out, and it just happened to be those people that works in the sweatshops.
Right, because they are the weakest in terms of negotiating power.
Exactly.
They're the ones who bear the costs.
Exactly. So I wouldn't say at this point, it's wrong. It's definitely not right, but it's not specifically wrong. And you can just say it's just business.
Right. Sure.
It's just business.
It's just business.
Yes.
Yes, and that is the defense that the MNCs would use.
Exactly.
Is it's just business. Yeah. Here's the key question here, and I think Daniel's getting at this. Can a consensual contract, that is a contract where the parties are mutually consenting, be coerced, and I mean here just soft coercion, or we might say be non-free or not be free. Be coerced or non-free. That's the key question here. And I guess, I'll just put my cards on the table. I think that a free contract can be coerced in soft terms. I think there can be exploitation going on in a free contract. Just because the contract is free, I would argue, does not make it moral. How is this the case? Well, there are all sorts of ways for more powerful parties in asymmetric bargaining situations to exploit weaker parties, even when weaker parties are freely consenting to the contract. For instance, if the more powerful party makes it such that the weaker party's other options are so bad that the weaker party feels they have no other choice, then, honestly, that's kind of exploitation. It's something to think about. I hesitate to, well, I won't go there. I won't use an analogous moral example, but I will say this. I have been around a while, and I have seen all sorts of contracts, business arrangements made. And I have seen some that are pretty clearly moral arrangements and others that I think are immoral. And a characteristic that is common among the immoral arrangements is that they often involve asymmetric bargaining power, and the more powerful party seeks to ensure that the weaker party is all but forced to come to the negotiating table on the more powerful party's terms. And the weaker party pretty much doesn't have a real choice at the end of the day. Yes, there is a de facto choice, but the real choice, there aren't really any other options. Doesn't happen to exist. I don't know, that would be my response here. I would say that a consensual contract can be coerced. But I recognize that's controversial. Okay, so let me put it out there and ask if anybody disagrees. Does anybody want to push back? Does anybody want to argue on behalf of the companies that are running these sweatshop systems? I know that's unpopular, but you're welcome.
Take both sides.
Yeah, this is a key crucial issue of our time in business. So let's put it all on the table and let's say, let's have the different sides available. If anybody wants to make the case on behalf of the MNCs, let's go for it. Okay.
Let's say I'm a CEO of Nike.
Okay, we're going to do the Nike case in a minute, by the way.
Huh?
We're going to do the Nike case in a minute after the break, by the way.
And then, so I'm having to talk to my starving Vietnamese child.
Okay.
And, I just have to tell this girl who's literally 9 years old.
Okay.
But I'll have to tell her, hey, I can raise a living standard here for everyone, but that means that I do have to sell my Nike shoes in Gucci price. In US, I'm gonna start selling Nike shoes with $500.
Okay.
Because I want to give you, $30 an hour instead of 2 cents an hour now. And then I don't know how it is, and this 9-year-old will just look at me like, oh, that's cool. But then I would have to tell her, I can give you 2 cents an hour, but I can support you with 2 cents an hour until you're 15. But if I start doing $30 an hour for you right now and sell my Nike shoes for $500 in US, we are probably gonna go bankrupt in 1 year.
Right.
So I would have to tell her, we are all of us going to get bankrupt in a year. Do you want to have a really good 1 year of your life, or just have a good?
No, that's great. Yeah. So he's saying, look, one argument that could be made is, look, this system means that the most efficiency is being achieved in the supply chain, and that's true. That is true. It is most efficient when the workers who will work for the least amount of money are the ones assembling these products and stuff like that. That is the most efficient way to do it. But that efficiency, so he's saying, on behalf of Nike CEO, will ultimately lead to a better, overall, more prosperous arrangement, including for the workers in the developing world themselves, including this 9-year-old Vietnamese girl. Yes?
I just don't know how I will, like, if I'm Nike CEO, I would love to, give her $30 an hour, but, like, how can I market $500 tennis shoes? I mean, I don't know. I mean, because I would never buy Nike for $500.
Sure. Right.
There is a market for $500 Nikes.
Air Jordans go for, like, I think it's more than 500
Like
actually.
normal academy shoes. Like when you go academy.
Yeah, for sure. Of course.
And then all of a sudden we don't see Nikes in academy anymore, but at Galleria next to Louis Vuitton.
Yeah.
But yeah, run it. They give you shin splints.
So,
$500, like, why would you buy it?
no, totally. I'm there with you. So I think that this is interesting, and I think that this is good because it is an argument that is often used by MNCs, right? If I were to raise worker conditions and improve the wages and all that, that's going to hurt my margins.
I'll have
And
a contest. I'll ask my workers to find a marketing strategy where we can start having people pay $500 for our shoes.
right, okay. Yeah. So I think that this is reasonable. I guess the way I would push back against that pro-MNC argument, and I think it's a great argument, I guess the way I would push back against it is I would say, yeah, it's going to hurt your margins, but when you're making $400 million a year counting your stock options, honestly, it doesn't look like your margins are that thin to begin with. And if they're as fat as it looks like when you're making $400 million a year in stock options and all your exec team is as well, it begins to look a bit more like exploitation of the vulnerable and a bit less like you running a company with the tightest possible margins and maximizing your efforts to try to improve the lot of the workers in the supply chain as you do so. It's something to think about, There's one other argument that could be made here, and that is one that I think a lot of MNCs make on behalf of this system. We're making a lot of money now, and it's justified because we're going to give back a substantial percentage of it. And the giving back part will justify the way in which we made the money. Okay? All right, that's an argument that you often hear in business, not just in defense of the sweatshop system, but in a lot of different areas of business. The argument is that, yeah, what we're doing is kind of dirty. Maybe it's real dirty, but we're going to make a lot of money doing it, and we're going to give back the money, and the giving back part justifies the bad way in which we made the money. Okay? What do we make of that kind of an argument? It's kind of a consequences-based argument. The ends giving back, assuming that they actually do give back. I'm not sure they do. But the ends justify the means is kind of what the argument is saying. What do we make of that kind of an argument? Any thoughts? Did I stump you guys with that one? Yes, Yara.
And I think, is it, when they say that when companies give back in the case, where was that like a donation, charity type of thing, or is it more?
It might take many different forms. We're going to look at Nike Gives Back in a minute in our case study. And for them, it takes the form of things like supporting education for girls, since young girls are the main demographic group that they have historically exploited in their factories. So now they support education for young girls in the developing world as a way, I think, of improving their public image, but maybe there's some genuineness there, and they're actually trying to make it right, since they made the money from these young girls, now they're trying to like help support young girls with education. I think that might be the sort of form it would take. Daniel.
I don't know if you know about this sort of details, but I heard that some CEOs or higher ranked people in a corporate or a corporate, when they do charity, it's more for the purpose of being able to keep the fortune to themselves, because like running taxes or any type of other ways that they have when they have to give away the money. Because I heard, I think it's when an individual passes down the the heritage to their descendants, you have to pay a certain
The estate tax.
estate tax or
Yeah.
something like that. And
Yeah.
to avoid that, they donate to a charity, or they create like their own funds, like a foundation or something. So
Yeah, many very wealthy people for sure do approach charitable giving that way, and they give away charitably precisely so as to avoid basically the equivalent in taxation.
right.
Yeah, so that's a frequent practice for sure. Not all wealthy people do that. I've known some very generous wealthy people, but there are a lot of them that do, for sure. And that's, I'm sure, something that corporations practice as well. I think Amazon is kind of notorious for doing that, actually. Bezos is notorious for just giving away only as much as he can, like, shave off from his taxes.
I wouldn't be surprised.
Okay, I want to say one other thing about this. I want to talk about the collective action problem here. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we will talk about really a crazy kind of a problem in bringing about a collective action that everyone knows to be right, but it's impossible to do. Okay, so let's take a 2 or 3 minute break, and then we will return to the difficulty of stamping sweatshops out.